It's that time of year again. Unfortunately, I'm feeling a little under the weather and this cold refuses to leave me, so my sincere apologies for the poorer than usual voiceover. Anyway, just like last year, this isn't necessarily a best of list for what released in 2018, but rather I'll briefly recover the noteworthy stuff that I reviewed this year. Starting off with my bottom 5 movies. This had the potential to be pretty cool, but it dropped the ball. The characters are lame and the story tries to be both serious and campy at once, without excelling at either. The hardcore Resident Evil fans will have already seen this, but there are better action movies for everyone else. I'm gonna have to rate this one 2 oofs and a yikes due to the gross mishandling of its subject matter. You can't have a love story with a basis on statutory rape and make that the secondary element that never gets resolved. While it does keep the sex scenes tasteful and the relationship is fairly realistic, the movie really needed to do more to address the elephant in the room. And besides that, the story isn't really all that special anyway. The acting's pretty good, but that's about it. I don't want to be too harsh on this movie because it is very clearly an indie film on a tight budget. But it sucks and it's misguided. The characters are not interesting at all, but the movie is trying so hard to sell you on them, and the 80s aesthetic is unwarranted. Those practical effects are pretty solid, but that's hardly enough to save this movie. There's about 3 to 4 episodes that take place in a library where the main characters just read books. That's a problem. The plot does not progress in between the first 2 and last 2 episodes. Instead, it gets stretched out with backstory to backstory to backstory. While the first season did have a fair bit of cursing, season 2 goes way overboard. My recommendation is to watch all of season 1 and then just watch the last 2 episodes of season 2. Don't bother with the rest. Resident Evil has always had a history of dipping its foot into campy waters. That is, when it doesn't entirely dive right in. But then there's Degeneration, which does a complete 180 and hightails it in the other direction. Wisecracking Leon is completely serious now, and the whole tone of the movie is dark and gritty. Throw in a handful of original characters with no depth to them for the story to focus on, and you've got a recipe for disaster. It shouldn't have been this way, but Degeneration refused to have any fun. Instead, it's a test in boredom and a disappointing low point for the franchise. Up next are the top 5 movies I reviewed in 2018. I think this movie gets kind of a bad rap, but I can certainly understand why. The acting's not great, except for John Leguizamo's stellar performance, and the downright awful special effects make this movie memorable for the wrong reasons. But at least it's a movie that knows to have fun, and a few of the scenes actually look pretty good. It's not necessarily something that I'm comfortable with recommending, but you could do way worse, and this is alright if you're in the mindset for a schlock movie. The best way I can describe Vendetta is that it's basically an over-the-top Resident Evil anime. But even that doesn't come close to describing how ludicrous this movie is. The story is dumb as hell. You really cannot make this up. But man, it's so stupid that it is worth checking out. While Degeneration was too serious and Vendetta was way too goofy, Damnation managed to hit a nice balance between the two, and it worked out great. The story and characters are a little more complex than one would expect from Resident Evil, but it doesn't allow itself to get bogged down by it, and there's plenty of fan service to be had as well. Damnation hits a lot of the right notes, and it might just be the best Resident Evil movie out there. A more down-to-earth and laid-back anime, but with a story that has serious stakes and relatable characters. It's easy to immerse yourself in this world thanks to how effective of a period piece this movie manages to be. It works both as a romance and a war movie without pushing too hard in either direction. It's not quite perfect, there are a few directorial choices that I don't quite agree with, but it is an excellent movie all around. This movie is pretty much perfect to me. The editing, pacing, writing, and cinematography all come together masterfully to create a solid film. And the attention to detail makes this an extremely effective period piece to boot. The main actress does a phenomenal job, and while the supporting cast don't share anywhere near as much of the limelight, they also play their roles excellently. It's not the most exciting movie, and some of the scenes can outlive their welcome, so it's not the easiest movie to recommend. But if you want an emotional drama that's backed up by some excellent acting, then I'd say this might be one of the best. And with that, we're switching gears to my bottom 10 video games of this year. A generic gangster-themed third-person shooter with some absolutely absurd cutscenes. The scripted AI pathing almost reminds me of Winback, which is pretty embarrassing. But for the most part, this game is at least playable. It's only below average, so it could have been much worse, but there's still not much worth seeing here. Once again, another below average game. The way the screen constantly jumps up and down would be enough of a problem, but Sigi adds on to that with bad weapons, uninspired enemies, and a theme based around farting for absolutely no reason. I don't get it. It's as bare bones of a platformer as you can get, but it's still hardly terrible. Now we're getting into some real bad stuff. Survivor is arguably the more famous black sheep of the Resident Evil family, especially now that the Angry Video Game Nerd did a video on it. The slow movement speed, fire rate, and boring story all lead to a pacing nightmare that's likely to put anyone to sleep. At least it's easy and short, but there's no fun to be had the whole way through. As bad as Sigi was, at least it didn't run at the speed of molasses. I get it, all of Deep Ones takes place underwater. That's still not a good excuse for having slow and boring gameplay. The visuals are okay and the music has its moments, but the whole game as a whole is awful. Winner of over 200 Game of the Year awards. I still don't understand how or why, I really don't get it. This game has an absolute mess of problems that constantly get in the way. The artificial intelligence is embarrassing and the combat is a joke. I think there's a decent game buried somewhere in there, but the amount of work it would take to retrieve it is way too much. The addition of virtual reality did absolutely nothing to help this game. If anything, I would argue that it just made it worse. But at the very least, it does manage to be a video game. I can at least say that. Unlike Eyed Kutkh, which is debatable. I might be too harsh here since this is clearly supposed to be an unambitious, small-scale, story-based game, but that's also precisely why I don't think it's worth playing. It's cute and I always appreciate experimental approaches, but this is something that really should have been free. Speaking of which, here's another one, a match 3 puzzle game. That's about all there is here. I would have given this a pass if the story was at least halfway decent, but no, of course it isn't. It also feels kind of unfinished as every ending brings the game to a pretty abrupt stop. There isn't even an endless mode like a traditional puzzle game would have, or any multiplayer despite the game being set up like a versus match. It's a lame game that's trying to sell you on its aesthetic alone and absolutely nothing else. And not even that comes close to being worth the price. We're about to enter the bottom of the barrel here. Cruz Brothers looks and plays like a bad fighting game made in Adobe Flash. And everything about this game just screams low production quality. The only worthwhile thing to see here are the story cutscenes, which just about manages to hit that sweet spot of so bad it's good. If nothing else, the artwork is hilarious to look at. But at the very least, it's not like Cruz Brothers was intensely frustrating to play through. Unlike Neverend, which is an awful roguelite with dreadfully slow combat and shockingly unforgiving difficulty. Don't let the artwork of the cool looking skull fool you, this game is absolute trash. Neverend would have been fine as a conceptual student project, but it's downright insulting to charge money for this. But of all the game genres to mess up, How the hell do you manage to flub Breakout? This game came out just fine for the Atari 2600. This is downright embarrassing. It's hard to see what's going on, the paddle only moves digitally rather than analog, and random effects keep going off with no rhyme or reason. It's not as interesting as a whole lot of other games, but just based off of production values alone, this is one of the worst games I have ever played. As hard as it is for me to admit, even Amy tried harder than either Neverend or Energy Invasion, and I think that is really saying something. And finally, let's end this on a good note with my top 10 games of 2018. If it wasn't for having to grind for points so much towards the end of the game, I would have ranked this higher. It's a pretty well done and creative twin-stick shooter with good music and cool pixel art. The animation isn't exactly the greatest, but it's not a bad game at all. It's mediocre at its worst, but it's plenty of fun at its best. As far as walking simulators go, this one's kind of worth looking into. The world is beautiful and unique, and simply exploring is half the fun. The puzzles aren't very difficult, but they're creative enough to be interesting. The story is also brief but engaging at the same time. Maybe a little bit pretentious, but this game's not bad at all. It is a bit overpriced though. While Rush of Blood isn't going to come close to the all-time greats of Time Crisis or House of the Dead, it does manage to put up a good fight. It's way too short and there's no bonus content to speak of, but if you can get this for cheap, then it's a great virtual reality game to play through once. With a group of like-minded buddies who are all into platformers, this can be an awesome party game to come back to again and again. Unfortunately, a lack of matchmaking and hardly any single-player content makes this a hard sell for more lonesome players such as myself. But I can see the potential this game holds, and I still found it to be really fun for the few times that I managed to get in a room with other random players. This one is kind of a hard sell because of how clunky and unintuitive this game can be, but give it a chance and you'll find a unique take on the roguelike genre. After a few repetitive runs, the game does start to show cracks in the foundation, especially with the bosses, but the controls are tight and the game manages to stay fun throughout. It's got some killer music too. This is pure platforming bliss, a massive collection of challenging levels with minimal fluff to waste a player's time. Not every level is a winner, but the vast majority of the game is plenty of fun to get through. Super Meat Boy and Celeste are no doubt more well known, but this one should not be overlooked. If you can look past the obvious Japanese otaku appeal, you'll find that this is actually a fairly competent rail shooter. And despite the game's few environments being reused so often, the levels do manage to stay fresh so it doesn't get boring. The writing is also hilarious in that dumb, self-aware kind of way. It's too bad that the game is still so expensive, but it's not a bad game at all to pick up if you can find it on a deep discount. Now, I mostly praised this game when it first came out, but the more I played it, the less happy I ended up with it. I don't like the severe lack of defensive options in this game. Certain characters dominate way too hard, and I swear that the online netcode actually got worse further down the line. It's no Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3, but despite everything, it is a really solid and very well done 2D fighting game. It's not my personal preference, but I won't fault anyone for liking it, and if you're interested in it, even if it's just for the Dragon Ball appeal, then yeah, go for it, it's a good one. And I wasn't sure what to expect of this, but I'm fully satisfied with what I got out of Resident Evil 7. It manages to be frightening while having a fun combat system too. Exploring and solving puzzles while avoiding the bakers is a ton of fun. The game kinda drops off during the second half, and there's no additional content outside of paid DLC, but even a single romp through the main game is well worth it. So far, I've put in over 330 hours into Monster Hunter World, and I'm not joking when I say that I still want to keep playing. I played through the whole game on my own, and again from the beginning with my brother once he got the game. It's not too often that a game manages to hook me so strongly. Titanfall 2 had that effect, but that was mostly thanks to the excellent multiplayer alone. And Demon Souls and Dark Souls had me coming back again and again, but at this rate Monster Hunter World is easily going to surpass both of them combined. It's simply a joy to play for its own sake. I seriously can't get enough of it, and the free content updates kept giving me reasons to play some more. Once I eventually got bored of the gun lance, I messed around with the longsword and the hammer and found myself having a blast all over again. I will say that it can get really grindy at times if you're going for the harder to get items, but I just found that as a further excuse to keep going. Monster Hunter World hits so many of the right notes. While the story is a little too forced on the player, especially when you're waiting on someone to finish a cutscene so you can join them in a cooperative match, the gameplay is so well done and so satisfying that you just want to keep going. Out of every game that I've played this year, this one receives my highest recommendation. No other game came close. Thanks for watching my best of list for 2018, and for everyone's continued support. I plan to keep this going well into 2019 and hopefully beyond. Thanks for sticking around, and Happy New Year.
You and me, boy, until we bleed out.